Well, today Moscow has finally voiced its demands for ending Russia's war against Ukraine. And these demands once again tell us that Putin is trying to speak in an ultimatum tone, and Trump will still have to act. In particular, the publication has learned the key demands of Moscow at the negotiations. This is the issue of NATO, the issue of sanctions, plus Russia is demanding to resolve the issue of frozen assets in the West. They say, give us back our frozen money, otherwise we are not going to stop the war. At the same time today, the Russian negotiator Medinsky stated that he had a phone conversation with the Ukrainian Defense Minister Umerov and proposed a new meeting. According to the Russian representative, Russia is supposedly waiting for a response from Ukraine right now. Zelensky states that Ukraine contacted Russia to obtain that very memorandum, but so far there is nothing. And Zelensky says that the Russians are constantly looking for reasons to delay the negotiation format, through which a way to end the war could be found. In this episode, we will discuss with you what demands Russia is putting forward, how new they are, or if these are the same old patterns that have been voiced before. And what exactly is hidden in that very memorandum on ending the war that Russia is preparing? My name is Alexei Pichi. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like this episode, and write your comment. Also subscribe to my Telegram channel, the link to it is in the description of this video. There I post up-to-date news as soon as it becomes available. So, today the publication released the key demands of Moscow at the negotiations. And among the key demands of Putin for ending the war against Ukraine is a written refusal from the West to expand eastward. This means the same thing as NATO not expanding. Let me remind you that Putin has been running around and fooling Russians for years, claiming that supposedly NATO once promised him personally, or maybe not him but someone from the Kremlin, that it would not expand. And then it just went ahead and started expanding. So they deceived Putin, deceived the Russians, and the North Atlantic Alliance kept expanding anyway. When reasonable people said, wait a minute, if there was a promise, but where is the document that states that NATO promised Russia it wouldn't expand? It seemed that there was no such document, it simply didn't exist, and Putin's people came up with the idea that, well, they just took their word for it. It was an oral agreement and a handshake. But in Russia, in the old days, there was a tradition that if you shook hands, it meant you had reached an agreement, it meant you had sealed the deal. And that's why Putin says, they deceived us, but there was no document. Well, again, I can say that in words, I could agree on anything about whatever, but if there is no document, then it means there is no agreement. Well, and now Putin is demanding that the West actually write in a document that there will be no expansion to the east. It is noted that such a decision would effectively exclude the membership of Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and in general any other former Soviet republics in NATO. In addition, among the Kremlin's demands are the neutral status of Ukraine and official protection for Russian-speaking citizens. Russia also demands that the West lift some of the sanctions on Moscow and resolve the issue of frozen assets. So what's going on, Russians? What happened? Why is Putin asking for at least some of the sanctions on Moscow to be lifted? After all, the sanctions have only been beneficial. After all, you even write in the comments under my videos, that we don't try to scare us with sanctions, they're not hurting us, we're only getting stronger. And Putin says, please lift at least some of the sanctions from us. In addition, one of the sources reported that if it is impossible to reach an agreement diplomatically, Putin will try to show Ukraine and Europe on the front lines that tomorrow the world will become even more painful. Putin is ready for peace, but not at any cost, noted one of the high-ranking Russian officials on condition of anonymity. According to one of the sources, if Putin sees a tactical opportunity on the battlefield, he will advance further into Ukraine. In addition, the Kremlin believes that Russia can wage war for years, regardless of the sanctions and economic difficulties imposed by the West. Another source notes that Putin is currently less inclined to make territorial compromises and is sticking to his public position. He wants full control of Moscow over 4 regions of Ukraine: Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson. As the agency notes, Russia currently controls just under 1/5 of the country, although Russia's advances have accelerated over the past year. The war is very costly for both Russia and Ukraine in terms of casualties and military expenses. It is also noted that Ukraine has repeatedly called not to give Russia the right to veto Kyiv's accession to NATO. Ukraine also asked the West to provide strong security guarantees from the West that will help it deter any future attack from Russia. NATO itself has previously stated that it will not change its open door policy because of Moscow's demands. Well, now let's see if they will really stick to this position. Well, today it has already become known that the next round of negotiations between the Ukrainian and Russian delegations is being prepared. Today, the head of the Russian delegation at the negotiations in Istanbul, Vladimir Medinsky, stated that he had a phone conversation with the Ukrainian Minister of Defense, Rustam Umerov, and proposed a date and place for the next meeting. Medinsky emphasized that the conversation was initiated by him, not by the Ukrainian Minister of Defense, Umerov, as previously stated by the Ukrainian leader, Vladimir Zelensky. It is noted that during the conversation, Medinsky allegedly proposed an exact date and place for a meeting to exchange memorandums, which outlined the list of conditions for ending the war. According to Medinsky, Russia is ready to immediately begin substantive discussions on each point of the future ceasefire agreement right on the spot. He also added that after his proposal, the Ukrainian side went to consult. After that, Umerov stated that we handed over a clear document to the Russians, which contains all our conditions. But, as Medinsky stated, this is where the nerve game begins, because Medinsky says apparently the meeting dragged on. We are waiting for confirmation from them as soon as possible and are ready to meet in person on the date we have indicated in the coming days, and to start working in the interests of long-term peace and saving human lives. At the same time, the spokesperson of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Press Alkash, Maria Zakharova, stated that the Russian Federation does not know what and to whom the Ukrainian side handed over. Answering a question about the fact that the United States President's Special Representative Kit Kellogg stated that he had already received a list of peace agreement conditions from Ukraine. Next is a quote from Zakharova. Our delegation is proceeding from the agreements reached on May 16th during the direct Russian-Ukrainian negotiations in Istanbul. We agreed that each side, Russia and Ukraine, would prepare its own introduction of modalities for settlement and ceasefire. After that, they will exchange the respective documents directly and discuss them at the next round. We did not have any agreements on mediation by the United States or other countries in the exchange of drafts. It was interesting that the world thinks we have already given our memorandum to the Russians, while the Russians say, we will not give anything to Ukraine. We are only ready to discuss something in direct negotiations, once again making their ultimatums and threats. And here it's interesting that Zelensky says, yes, indeed, we contacted the Russians to get their memorandum, but so far we haven't received anything from them. In E, Zelensky states that Russia is doing everything possible to drag out these negotiations. And then his quote, we want to do everything so that the whole world forces Russia to end the war. He made this statement during a meeting with Friedrich Merz in Berlin. And, in particular, as Zelensky says, Allied cooperation is underway and constant contact is being maintained. As the President said, what matters is not the venue where negotiations between Ukraine and Russia will take place, but the result, the end of the war. This is exactly what Ukraine is striving for. Zelensky added that Ukraine is open to any format of negotiations so that Russia cannot once again say, well, we don't really want to. And he pointed out that from the Russian side, there are claims that they don't really want the negotiations to be imposed by Western countries, the Vatican or Geneva, maybe Istanbul again, or maybe not Istanbul. Well, and further he quotes Zelensky verbatim. They will constantly look for reasons not to end the war, although, to be honest, it doesn't look very serious. They don't want to go to neutral Geneva, but they want to go to a NATO country, to Turkey. So the question is not about what kind of country it is or which alliance it belongs to. The question is exclusively about Putin, exclusively about their delay. They are constantly looking for reasons to delay the format in which the war can be ended. Well, and further, he added that everyone wants at least a ceasefire as a first step. And Zelensky says, I think it's only because of pressure, because otherwise they simply don't want to do anything. We are really waiting for sanction measures. Well, and here further, Zelensky noted that Ukraine was waiting for proposals from the Russians about further peace negotiations, both before the major exchange of prisoners of war and after it, but up to now the Russians have not provided the promised memorandum on steps to end the war. Quote, our side was in contact with the Russians. Defense Minister Umerov called the Russian Mr. Medinsky, who headed the Russian delegation at the meeting in Istanbul. Yes, they said there would be a memorandum, but we never received it. No one received it. We asked the United States. They are also waiting. Everyone is waiting. We shouldn't wait. We should probably take more serious steps. And here is an important point. Let me remind you that Lavrov, before the prisoner exchange, said that as soon as the exchange is over, we will immediately hand over the memorandum. Well, the exchange is over, several days have already passed, and there is still no memorandum. In turn, Friedrich Merz added that Germany will support any efforts that will lead to further negotiations. Quote, "These negotiations were agreed upon when the first round of technical talks took place, which was held in Istanbul. But as the Ukrainian president said, we have been waiting for many days for this so-called memorandum, and we do not see any willingness from the Russian side for any negotiations at all, regardless of where they might take place." The German Chancellor also added that he is grateful to Zelensky for the fact that the President of Ukraine is ready to negotiate with the Russians without preconditions. And Merz also noted that European partners are interested in being part of the negotiation process together with American partners. Quote, "It's important that these negotiations take place at all. In recent days and weeks, there have been absolutely no diplomatic efforts from the Russians to conduct any negotiations. If someone still seriously claims now that we have done little in the diplomatic sphere, then obviously they have just slept through the last 3 weeks. Because there have been more diplomatic efforts from the European side in the last 3 weeks than during the entire time of this war. So, these are the conditions the Russians are putting forward, but at the same time they are dragging out the entire negotiation process as much as possible, which in principle was to be expected from the Russians." I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to leave a like.